Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. The world is aghast at what's happening in Ukraine, hospitals bombed, indiscriminate shelling, and summary executions. It's even prompted President Biden to use the word genocide. But tragically, holding people and nations to account for war crimes isn't that easy. Our next guest knows this well. He's Peter Bouckaert. He spent much of the last 3 decades as one of Human Rights Watch's war crimes investigators, where he was head of their emergencies team. Hello and welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much indeed. You are in Madagascar.
Yes, it looks like it's a bit warmer here than in the UK right now.
Yeah. You've lived there for some time, and we'll come to that in just a second. But just to start with, Peter, just describe what your job was with Human Rights Watch. It was an incredible job, a very, very important job, but just tell us a bit about it.
You know, when I joined Human Rights Watch in the mid-1990s, the human rights movement was still very much focused on the former Soviet Union and political and civil rights, the rights of people to publish books, to speak freely, and to be in dissent. Because a lot of the human rights movement came out of the repression that occurred at the time in the former Soviet Union. But then with the war in the Balkans and Rwanda, we decided to start focusing more on what was happening in war zones as well. So my job at Human Rights Watch for more than 20 years was to first establish a program to investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity in conflict zones. And I would go into these conflict zones while the conflict was still going on with my team and try to establish exactly what was happening on the ground.
Peter, what's your own background? I can hear there's a mix of accents there, certainly an American influence, but how did you get into this, or what took you into it?
So I went to law school in the US. I'm Belgian, but I grew up in the United States. And after I completed my studies at Stanford Law School, well, actually, while I was studying at Stanford, I decided to go to South Africa in 1994 and had the opportunity to work for George Bizos, who was Nelson Mandela's lawyer. It was at the time of the transition in South Africa. So we actually wrote the Truth and Reconciliation Commission legislation, which looked into the crimes that were committed during the apartheid period. We did the first death penalty case. And from there, I kind of drifted by accident almost into Human Rights Watch and started working on this program to investigate war crimes.
It's been an incredible career, and we're going to look at some of the things that you've worked on and also where you and I have crossed paths as well, which is there's a very interesting case that we're going to talk about in a second. But I think it might help everyone just to talk about the legal framework. And when we talk about a crime, the obvious thing to say is the law has been broken. But most people are not going to be familiar with international humanitarian law, essentially the laws of war, when it comes to what's not meant to happen on the battlefield. So let's talk about that if we can. And I think possibly go straight in with 3 main principles in IHL, and that's distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So the modern system governing war really developed after World War II, when the world emerged out of the Holocaust. And there was kind of a global decision to put in place a system called the Geneva Conventions to govern war. People decided that we cannot just allow anything to happen in war, that there have to be some rules. So they developed the 4 Geneva Conventions, which govern the conduct of armed parties during both international conflicts and internal conflicts like civil wars. And basically, we have a set of 3 types of crimes that can be committed in conflict. The first is war crimes, which are individual acts by soldiers or their commanders that are illegal, such as executing a prisoner or committing rape, and that can be individually prosecuted. There, the idea is that countries themselves should prosecute individuals in their military who commit these crimes. And then secondly, at a higher level, you have crimes against humanity. And those are those same acts like murder and rape and things like that, but committed on a widespread and systematic scale. So if a country goes to war and they commit these kind of acts of murder, not just as an individual incident that can be prosecuted as an individual incident, but as a policy of war, they can be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. And then the ultimate crime in international law is the crime of genocide, obviously, which is an attempt to wipe out a distinct group of people. Whether it's a nation or a subgroup like LGBT people, for example, but where you really have the extent to exterminate. The basic principle of law that governs war is that you have to make a distinction between military objectives and civilians, and that you can only target military objectives, and that your military response has to be proportional to what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, if you have a small unit of 10 soldiers in a village, you can only target the base that they're based at. You have to take all precautions to avoid civilian casualties. So you have to use precision weapons to target that house. And if you decide to flatten the whole village in your attempt to wipe out this unit of 10 soldiers, that would be a disproportionate attack. So you always have to say, you have to identify your target. You have to make sure that it's a military target. And then you have to minimize the impact on civilians to avoid a disproportionate attack.
Okay, so that we're really talking about, so just to recap there, you've made the distinction between individual actions and actions by the state. And then you've talked about the responsibility that states have or warring parties have in sort of prosecuting or prosecuting a conflict. And that's distinction, proportionality, and precaution, as you've just outlined there. Yes. Bearing all that in mind, and I'm not asking you to try and prove a case, what do you think we are seeing in Ukraine at the moment? And then I'm going to come to other comparisons.
Well, what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment is very familiar to anybody who has covered other wars involving Russia. First of all, we're seeing the very clear disproportionate use of force. Instead of targeting military objectives, which they are doing in some cases, they're shelling entire cities and towns and destroying them. Most of the people who have died in this conflict have not been victims of executions, but they've been victims of indiscriminate shelling. So that clearly is out of line with international standards. It means that they're, first of all, not being proportional in the use of force, but also that they're not making a distinction between military targets and civilian homes. So that certainly is something that's very, very familiar to myself, having covered the Second Chechen War in 1999 and 2000, where Russia basically flattened all of Grozny, the capital, before they even went in with their soldiers. It seems that it's pretty clear on that Russia initially, or Putin initially, miscalculated. He tried to do a blitzkrieg kind of move all of these armored cars into Kiev and overthrow the government. And basically the Ukrainians were very well prepared for that kind of attack. And they took out all of the armored columns and the tanks and stopped that advance on Kiev. And
so for you, this is quite comparable to what you've seen before, to them reverting to standard Russian military textbook tactics.
Exactly. They did
relying on artillery.
They did the same thing during the first war in Chechnya. Many of the soldiers who were sent in during the first war in Chechnya didn't even know that they were going to war. They were just told, drive this way, basically. And they were similarly ambushed and destroyed during their initial offensive during the first war. And then they decided on massive bombardment. That's the first issue, the disproportionate and indiscriminate use of artillery fire and rocket fire. And one of the reasons why we see so much indiscriminate use of force is because Russia has basically run out of precision-guided weapons. They have some rockets still available, but it's clear that for their jets, their military jets, they don't have any more precision-guided weapons. So that's why so many planes are being taken out, so many jets are being taken out by the Ukrainians, because the jets have to fly low enough to drop what we call dumb bombs, gravity bombs, because they don't have precision-guided rockets that they can fire from kilometers, miles away.
Yeah. So that's the first bit. So you're talking about distinction and proportionality, and also it covers all three things, doesn't it? But what's the second thing you were going to say?
So the second thing is that we're seeing a lot of executions and cases of rape and torture, which is very consistent with how the Russian military operates. And we know in many cases that they are executions because we're seeing bodies on the ground with their hands bound. So if somebody is already in custody and has their hands bound, and then they end up with a bullet in their head, and obviously there's eyewitnesses to some of these incidents, it's a clear case of an execution or an act of murder, which is a war crime. And we've seen those in Bouckaert and in many of the other towns where the Russians have operated. So we're talking about a very ill-disciplined force, which is committing pretty grave atrocities, including rape.
That's what I was going to. In a second, I want to talk about how you actually go about investigating and then prosecuting these cases. But before I come to that, I just want to ask you if you were seeing the same pattern, and I presume you looked at things in Syria as well. You've seen the same pattern that took place in Chechnya. You talk about an ill-disciplined army. So I'm trying to. This is not a question so much about prosecuting the case, but a value judgment. Why are the Russians doing this?
Well, Russia's army has always been very underfunded and ill-trained. It relies a lot on very young conscripts who themselves are brutally abused within the Russian army. There's a lot of hazing. Soldiers are often hazed to death, and they have to serve their commanders in terms of making their food and paying bribes to their commanders. So it's a very abusive system within the Russian army. They're very ill-trained. They're very ill-motivated. And a lot of them do engage in acts of looting, for example. They'll take people's phones and televisions to take back home. It's your classic concept of an underfunded, ill-trained, and ill-disciplined army.
When we hold Western armies, it's a sort of cliche perhaps to go down this line, but we talk about rules of engagement, the instructions that all soldiers are given in a conflict, and that determines what you can and can't do. At what point do you use lethal force in a conflict? Do the Russians use this? Do they have rules of engagement?
They do have rules of engagement, but their rules of engagement are much looser. And you see it on the commands that have been intercepted of commanders giving orders to the commanders in the field saying, flatten this entire town, flatten it, flatten it. So their rules of engagement are basically, to use massive force against any potential threat, basically almost as an act of retaliation.
Okay, let's talk about how you actually go about prosecuting, or first of all, making a case if you're pursuing a war crimes case. So I know that you're involved indirectly in some of the investigations. What's your priorities if you're dealing with Bouckaert, for example, or Irpin? What would your priorities be? How do you go about gathering evidence? And then I want to come to examples of difficulties you've had with this.
Yeah, I mean, the first point I would just make is that we don't just investigate Russia, yes. We investigate all parties to the conflict around the world. I've carried out investigations of US conduct in Iraq and Afghanistan and documented some war crimes there as well. I've documented Israeli Defense Forces operations in Gaza and the West Bank. So it's very important for a human rights organization to be an objective organization. We're not there to go after one party. We're there to make sure that everybody respects the same set of rules. And we've investigated on the ground incidents of Ukrainian abuses as well, even in this conflict. Or I've assisted, since I'm no longer with Human Rights Watch, but I have assisted investigators on the ground on that. When we get to a scene, we have to establish the facts. It's very different from reporting, where you can kind of say, he said, she said, to build a story. We have to establish exactly what happened in this location. So we basically use 3 sets of information. The first is the evidence on the ground. I mean, the body and the gunshot wounds and the tied hands and all of that. It's very important that we can try to get to these scenes as quickly as possible to establish and document that evidence because it disappears very quickly. Bodies start to decompose, so they get buried. Handcuffs get cut off because people don't want to bury people with handcuffs. So the evidence disappears very quickly. The second is the eyewitness accounts. So we take very, very detailed statements from all of the eyewitnesses that we can identify in private, just me and the eyewitness and our translator. It's a process that can take 2-3 hours at least. And then we do it over and over again with all of the other eyewitnesses. And it's very details oriented because we're going to compare those small details to make sure that people are telling us the truth. Because, you know, war is also about winning the information war. And we have to understand that people want their side to win. So Ukrainians may tell us lies about what the Russians are doing just because they want to help the cause. So it's not just taking people's word for granted. It's really trying to establish whether they're telling us the truth.
So I see 2 developments that make your job perhaps possibly easier, but also more complex. I mean, one is social media, the abundance of evidence that's out there now, but also the manipulation of that evidence. And also linked to that is this politicization of controlling, people are much more aware that the message is important.
Yes, so the third element I was going to talk about is social media and satellite imagery. So we now have these new technology tools that really allow us to also use as investigative tools. The first is satellite imagery, because we can take the imagery from the sky and count the number of buildings, for example, which have been burned or destroyed in a town or a city. We used that very effectively in Myanmar to document the destruction of Rohingya villages during the ethnic cleansing there in 2017. The second one is social media. And yes, there's a massive amount of videos and photos and all kind of information out there on social media. And it has become a very important tool for us. I was about 200 meters away from Muammar Gaddafi when he was captured and killed in Sirte, but I didn't see it myself. But a few days later, a video emerged of his capture, which also showed about 40 men and children who had been detained alongside him. And I managed to, and the unit which had captured those men identified itself in the video. They took the video saying, look, we're the Tiger Brigade and we captured these people. I found their bodies the next day after Gaddafi was killed. And using that video, I was able to show that they had been alive in custody and that they had been killed afterwards. So, we did the same thing in Syria to establish hundreds of incidents where cluster bombs were used when we didn't have access to those villages. We did the same in Ghouta in Syria to establish that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons because we were able to show that the bombs which landed in Ghouta had earlier been documented on social media in government custody. So it is a very important tool. Obviously, we have to be very careful about manipulated videos and manipulated evidence, but we actually now have entire organizations and divisions within human rights groups who are specialized in analyzing and collecting that social media evidence.
I must say, I mean, when I worked briefly with Human Rights Watch in 2008, 2009, and I was tremendously impressed by the level of scrutiny, and that's from both with the help of people, for example, who know about weapons, but then fundamentally on the legal side and holding up everything that you investigate to a very high standard. So it's an impressive process. One additional thing, you talk about eyewitnesses and people being, you've got one example, I think, in Myanmar of people deliberately, you know, they think they've got a message to tell you. So, you know, they're really just telling you lies.
Yeah, I mean, I investigated a massacre during the conflict in Myanmar where a whole village was trapped by a river by the Burmese army. They then executed the men. They took the women and children individually to the huts of the village and beat the children to death, raped the women, beat them unconscious, and then put the houses on fire. So I met about a dozen women who survived the massacre with horrible burn wounds and obviously horrible memories. But one of the women I interviewed, she told me her husband had been killed. It was the first thing she told me in the interview, before I even had asked her name and kind of introduced myself, which struck me a little bit as odd. And then I came across an Al Jazeera video that had interviewed her a week before me, where she had just found out that her husband was still alive and had been reunited with her husband. So clearly she lied to me that her husband had been killed, although the rest of her story certainly was true. But it's that kind of often difficult and brutal fact-checking that we have to do to make sure that we have the truth, because we're accusing people of the worst possible crimes in the world. And we may have to go testify against them in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So we have to make sure that we get the facts right.
Yeah. Please do, everyone, start putting your questions in the Q&A box just below here, so that you can put your questions directly to Peter. I can see a couple coming in, but please do put more in there. Very sadly, the reality is, Peter, that most of the cases that you investigate never come to court. Isn't that true?
Yes. I mean, I have gone to testify at the Yugoslav tribunal a few times over crimes that were committed in Kosovo, actually against one of the Kosovo Albanian commanders, Limaj, rather than against the Serbian army. We testified against Milosevic for the crimes he committed in Kosovo. He died before he was held accountable. And I testified in a case against Macedonia. But in most of these cases, indeed, people do go unpunished. Sometimes they go unpunished because they come from powerful countries like the US or Israel, who do not want to participate in the international justice system, or simply because the will isn't there to hold them accountable. But I think that's looking through kind of the wrong angle, because what we have accomplished is that these conflicts do get analyzed in the context of law and war crimes, and that there is a code of conduct to war. And I think it's very important that we have that framework to discuss the actions of various nations. And a lot of times things do change because of the internal discussions we have, or because of the pressure we can put on various countries to change their behavior. I mean, for example, it's absolutely clear that Israel stopped its 2006 war in Lebanon because it just couldn't handle the international pressure it was under, but because of the high number of civilian casualties being caused by its bombing campaign, because they didn't have the intelligence available to actually target Hezbollah with their airstrikes. So we do have this impact that's less visible than a successful prosecution, but we have set the terms of the discussion, basically, which I think is an important accomplishment.
Another aspect of it is that you and I both know that the number of people who commit war crimes in a conflict is often very large. It's sadly, we think whether you think about Syria, you think about former Yugoslavia, and so one of the key concepts within war crimes prosecutions is command responsibility. You don't prosecute all the soldiers for involvement in some form of war crime, but it's up to the commander in charge of the unit or the political leader who sent them to go and do something to take responsibility for it, either to ensure it didn't happen or follow it up and prosecute it when it did happen, or they themselves were ordered and have to go on trial because of it. That's quite a difficult thing to do, isn't it?
Yes, and when I go to testify at these tribunals, or even when I go to meet the investigators, they often are not very interested at discussing the individual cases of murder or executions and all of those facts. They basically feel that's kind of already covered. It's well established. What they focus on in the interviews with me is what we know about the command responsibility. And basically there, the question is, what did the commander know? What did Milosevic know? And what did he do to continue these crimes or to stop them? So that knowledge of the crimes is very important. So whenever we do report on any country involving war crimes, we always send a registered letter to the officials that we do believe are in command, outlining the findings of the report, and that the delivery of that registered letter is one of the pieces of evidence that the prosecutor at the ICC wants.
Got it. That's very important. I want to talk briefly about one example. I won't get too bogged down in it. In 2001, I was reporting for the BBC and for The Guardian at the time, and it was the end of a conflict in Northern Macedonia, a conflict between essentially the government and ethnic Albanian guerrillas. And right towards the end of this conflict, there were some various actions took place in the run-up to a peace agreement. And at least, I can't remember the exact numbers. I mean, it was 8 or 10 people were killed in this village. And I was able to go in and document what had happened there, along with a few other reporters. Later, that was taken to trial at the Hague Tribunal. I was then working for the New York Times, and the New York Times has a policy of not allowing their reporters to give evidence to the tribunal, or any tribunal, or indeed courts, because they think that actually interferes with the impartiality of a journalist and their ability to collect information in future. So I was not allowed to testify. But Peter had my notes, and I'd spoken to him really straight after coming out of that incident. The man who led that police operation or oversaw it was the Interior Minister, Lube Boszkowski, and then he was actually prosecuted. He was extradited to the Hague Tribunal. What happened there, Peter?
Yeah, so it was the village called Lubotin in Macedonia. I was also on the ground at the same time and investigated it. It was actually a few more people. It was over a dozen people who had been individually killed in their homes, very similar to what we saw in Bouckaert. Macedonian troops sweeping through a village after an intensive battle and just going into homes and executing people. We carried out a detailed investigation. Unfortunately, our report was released on September 11, 2001. So I was reading the New York Times piece on the subway just as the planes hit the World Trade Center. But then later I went to testify against Boszkowski and the police commander who had been in charge of the operation. They were both prosecuted by the Yugoslav tribunal. And the police commander was held accountable. He was found guilty for the crimes which were committed during the operation. But Boszkowski was let go because he had ordered the internal investigation of the incident after Nick's BBC report and our HRW report. So just the simple fact that he had ordered that investigation, even though he was the official in charge,
And he was
was about
shown on TV. He was actually the Macedonian television had pictures of him there as the operation was going on. Yeah.
Yes, he loved to be filmed on the front lines of battle, Mr. Boskowski.
Yeah, incredible. He was actually later jailed for supposedly taking funds during an election campaign and spent 5 years in jail. And that trial itself actually didn't seem to be a very fair trial either. Yeah. He's now free. There are some numerous other incidents that he was involved in too, but it does show it's one example to show how difficult it is to hold people for command responsibility. I'm going to take a question from Marty Ryan, and then I'm going to ask Simon Jackson's question for him. Go ahead, Marty.
Hi, thanks. I'm in the US, and I know that the United States has never signed on to the International Criminal Court, and that we are also guilty of human rights violations. And so how do you go? I mean, you've talked to this a little bit, but how do you go about dealing with countries like us? And in this case, how might you go about dealing with the Russians who are creating or who are perpetrating human rights violations in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it is sad that the United States hasn't signed on to the International Criminal Court Charter. They also haven't signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and many other important conventions. So there is a certain level of US exceptionalism, I would say, in that they feel the rest of the world should respect human rights, but then they just assume that they will do it without being part of this global system. And I think it's a contradiction in terms of the leadership role the US would like to play on human rights issues, that they do not participate in some of these bodies. I mean, we certainly found very serious human rights and war crimes violations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, including acts of murder and excessive force and indiscriminate bombing in some cases. We had a more productive dialogue with the US military on some of these issues than we would have with some other militaries. And for example, in terms of their targeting rules for aerial bombardment in Iraq and Afghanistan, they did actually tighten them up a lot under the Obama administration after we raised our concerns. But then President Trump basically gave the military a green light to do whatever they want. So it kind of goes up and down when it comes to the American government. With the Russians, I mean, I think the best strategy that we can have to try to have an impact on some of these crimes that we see being committed in Ukraine is to try to identify individual commanders who are in these villages where these atrocities have been committed, and to put them on notice that they could be prosecuted for these war crimes. So to identify the command structure in Bouckaert, which we certainly are able to do. I mean, US and the EU can clearly do that with the intelligence they have available. And to say, you know, Commander Buyayev is in charge of these forces in Bouckaert. He's from this town. This is his resume. And we're going, if he steps foot in any European nation, he could be arrested and prosecuted. That's what was done with Syria. There's a number of European countries who've identified and prosecuted Syrian army officers who committed atrocities during the Syrian war. And I think that's basically the best deterrent policy we can develop to address some of these crimes. Because going after Putin, I mean, Putin is going to leave the Kremlin in a box. He's not going anywhere. So I think that's too high a target to go after, although it's obviously very important to criticize him and to put him on notice that these crimes are being documented.
Lots more questions coming in. I'm just going to sort of follow up with a question from Sarah Biffin, just saying that was anybody held responsible after Chechnya? You mentioned Syria. Were any Russians held responsible after Chechnya?
No, absolutely not. And actually, one of the commanders who was killed by one of the generals who was killed by the Ukrainian forces, they've killed at least 6 generals so far, was the general who was in charge of the Second Chechen War.
Right. Okay. It's interesting to see that with other countries, Israel, for example, several senior Israeli commanders have actually been detained or told to go back on a plane in London because there's an arrest warrant for them based on war crimes accusations. So while some countries don't subscribe to it, it is effective in terms of targeting individuals, as Peter was explaining.
And I think that that lack of accountability has spread into impunity for Chechen forces associated with President Kadyrov of Chechnya, who's a very abusive warlord, to even commit assassinations on European soil. I mean, they've killed several Chechen dissidents in Germany and Austria over the years.
Diane Cook. You there, Diane? Just need to open your microphone. I know you're there. Okay, this is Diane's question. How do you see the impact of successful prosecutions at the ICC on commanders in the field? So she's basically following up on that question. Have you seen anybody adjust their evidence of impact of your reports? Can you see, actually, I mean, you talked about the Americans and that's with you direct having contact with them, but can you mention any other fields of conflict?
So I was in the Central African Republic in 2015 and 2016 during their very brutal civil war, when one day over 1,000 people were killed in fighting. And the next day, we had to shelter at a military peacekeeping base. And the next day, I went to see the commanders of the Seleka rebels who had committed all of these killings. I took a whole bunch of maps, satellite maps with me, and we sat down, me in a circle of a bunch of people with a lot of weapons, and my photographer, Marcus Bleasdale, and I showed them all of the villages that we had documented that they had burned. And I showed them my notebook and said, we are documenting every atrocity that you're committing. I know that 4 days ago, you tied up 3 people and threw them in the river to drown them while they survived, and I interviewed them. And I know you shot a mother by the river this morning and her baby is still next to it, and I'm going to go get it afterwards. But we are going to prosecute you. We're going to go to the ICC and we're going to hold you accountable. We know your names. And one guy got so upset with me that he cocked his gun. And the head of the military intelligence of the rebels stopped him and said, Peter came in 2007 to save us from the presidential guard when they were going to wipe us out. He helped us before, and we have to listen to him. And the next day, he ordered his troops to go back to the base so they couldn't commit atrocities in the village anymore. So it may sound crazy, but people, even when we have very few prosecutions at the ICC, people fear being prosecuted and they fear being held accountable. And we have to make sure that they know that they're being watched and being investigated, and that they can end up in jail for the crimes they commit.
That's a huge thought in Russia, which for such a long time feels that it's a power and doesn't have to be responsible. That's an open question. I wonder if that would change. Philip Godfrey.
Yeah, Peter, hello. Fascinating. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Peter, some people would say that over the last 15 to 20 years, we've entered an era of the death of truth, the era of fake news. How has that, if at all, colored the work that you've been doing? This idea that there is no such thing in some people, left or right of the political spectrum, there's no such thing as an objective truth. I may be being a bit philosophical by saying that, but I think you get my point. How's that impacted on the work, the forensic work that you need to do?
Yeah, so I investigated the IDF operation in Jenin in the West Bank in the early 2000s, where They went into a refugee camp, a Palestinian refugee camp, and had a very fierce battle, and basically destroyed the camp and killed a bunch of people. So I issued my report, and it said that 56 people had died in the operation, and that 28 of them were Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants, and 28 civilians. So the head of the Palestinian negotiation team called me and said to me, "Why do you have to say only 56 people died?" Because he had said up to 1,000 people were dead and that there were mass graves. And I said, well, because the governor of Jenin and the Palestinian Authority say 56 people died. And he says, yes, but why do you have to say it? Because he wanted us, in solidarity with the Palestinians, to just keep quiet. And I said, because it's my job to establish the truth, not to, feed into these false narratives. So there is an incredibly important role for good journalism and good investigations to establish the truth. And obviously, we're going to be attacked for our findings. When I wrote a report saying that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons in Ghouta, the very renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning, but slightly elderly at that time, journalist Cy Hirsch wrote a piece that got rejected by the New Yorker, arguing that it was the Saudis. And then he wrote a second piece saying it was the Turks. That was also rejected because it was full of baloney. But it was published by the London Review of Books, who apparently published just about anything these days without much fact-checking. And obviously, every time people like Chomsky and other apologists for the Syrian regime talked about the chemical attacks, they would cite Cy Hirsch's armchair article rather than our investigation. So we do face these challenges, but I think it makes the work of responsible journalists and investigators even more important.
Simon Jackson's got a good question here. He's not able to ask it himself, so I'm asking it for him. What precedent is there for going after the winners of cross-border conflicts? In other words, you seize a slice of somebody else's territory and keep it.
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And Russia has been extremely good at this kind of cross-border conflicts and getting away with it. They did it in Georgia.
You could say Israel too.
Yes. Well, Israel is in a permanent occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank keeps shrinking in size. They have not been held accountable for their actions in Lebanon. Certainly the track record is pretty poor when it comes to this, especially when countries are victorious in their wars and achieve their objectives. And obviously with Russia, we have the additional problem of it being a member of the Security Council. So they can veto any UN action against them, such as a referral to the ICC, which could be done by the Security Council.
Peter, what are your hopes then in Ukraine at the moment? I'm just looking at it seems to me that the reaction thus far has been pretty impressive. I mean, I'm just taking this from, I think this is BBC. So the Ukrainians have obviously launched their own investigations to what happened in Bouckaert. There's a prosecutor from the ICC who last month opened an investigation quite publicly. And then the United Nations Human Rights Council has also opened a commission of inquiry into the violations of law of war. What are your hopes? Where do you think, I mean, there's a huge amount to talk about, and I presume this conflict is going to go on for a very long period of time. What do you think should be happening, and what do you expect to happen?
Look, I think we need to understand that Europe and the US and Ukraine knew for a long time that this war was coming. So they prepared for it. One of the reasons why you see Ukraine being able to resist a massive Russian offensive is because they were well trained and well armed before this conflict. I mean, you had US Special Forces and British Special Forces training them in this kind of anti-armor combat, close combat, and they also prepared for these kind of investigations. So The Ukrainian authorities have the capacity to establish the evidence in these cases. They're now supported by the EU and many other efforts to collect the evidence of war crimes. I don't think we're ever going to get Putin prosecuted for this. But I do think there's a good possibility that some of the lesser commanders will be held accountable far down the line. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think the biggest loser in this may very well be Putin, because he's put his foot in a hornet's nest based on many false assumptions about what was going to happen in Ukraine. His own military intelligence misspent hundreds of millions of dollars, which were supposed to bribe the Ukrainian army to switch to the Russian sides. And he now has no way out of Ukraine, or at least no easy way out of Ukraine. And maybe that's a form of accountability as well. The number of forces and the number of weapons that he's losing in this conflict. And the world uniting against Russia and saying, against Putin, and saying, we will do whatever it takes to stop this war in Ukraine. I mean, the sanctions placed on Russia today are absolutely unprecedented. And they are, you know, some people say that it's because it's a war in Europe involving white people. I don't think that's true. I think because it's an unprecedented act of aggression against a peaceful state. I mean, we can criticize the US decision to go to war in Iraq under false pretenses, but Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was a pretty bad guy. And that is not at all the situation in Ukraine. So a lot of the world reaction is just about this naked act of aggression, and then the sheer brutality used in the war by Russia against Ukraine.
There are some people who say that, you know, Bush, Cheney, Tony Blair should be held account for prosecuting a war on false pretenses. I don't know whether you can phrase that in human rights terminology or in the laws of war.
Well, let's just say I was offered a position at the Blair Institute a few years ago, and I not so politely turned it down on that basis.
Right. Okay. That's not an academic question. I do with a couple of things I want to refer to. One is prisoners. The ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, has put out, you know, quite early on statements about international humanitarian law, and it's interesting they do talk specifically about prisoners. And obviously, we're seeing videos of huge amounts of Russian prisoners being taken and often being interviewed by Ukrainian soldiers and making statements, and in some cases being forced to call their family on videos, and in other cases people actually being, there's I think at least one video doing the round of Russian prisoners being tortured, and also others being shot on surrender. Is that being taken seriously enough by the Ukrainians?
I certainly think it can be taken more serious both by Ukrainians and by the international press, because a lot of journalists have written interviews with those detained POWs, prisoners of war, when they shouldn't be. They should be boycotting these kind of press conferences, saying that it's a violation of the Geneva Conventions. But even the BBC wrote a piece. You know, they had a line in there saying, we're not sure if these people are under duress or not, but they interviewed them anyway. And I think it would show a little bit more integrity if the journalists would just say, no, we're not going to do these kind of interviews with people.
Are you familiar with the law? I know that armies shouldn't be using prisoners of war for propaganda purposes or for sort of or humiliating them. So there's a whole range of terminology that restricts things such as interviews or putting them on camera.
Yes, they should not be subjected to humiliation. And under the general interpretation of the ICRC and human rights groups, that includes putting them on public display in this way. And, you know, you have to understand I mean, like one of the soldiers said, was asked what he thought about his commanders. And he responded, our commanders are a bunch of sissies. Now, if this person is released and goes back to Russia in a prisoner exchange, what is going to happen to him for criticizing their commanders? He may have done it out of conviction. He may have done it because he wanted to be in better favor with his captors, because he wanted to make a call to his mom, whatever. But you put people in extreme danger when you display them like this. And the same goes for the treatment of so-called collaborators in Ukraine. Without any kind of due process, people are being stripped naked in the street and tied to lampposts so people can spit on them and humiliate them because they're suspected of giving targets to Russia. We need to
or
be
shoplifting or going into a store.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we need to be really careful and watch also what Ukraine is doing. Especially, I mean, Putin calls them Nazis, which is obviously way off the mark. But there are some extreme right-wing nationalist groups, such as the Azov militia, that are active in Ukraine, who can be just as abusive as any Russian soldier.
I do want to get a few more questions in. We've got just under 10 minutes to go. So give us two more questions, please, in the Q&A box so we can put them to Peter before he goes. Peter, what keeps you going? Because you've seen a huge amount and you've got a family. You've gone back again and again and again to these conflicts. First of all, tell us what you're doing now, because you're no longer working for Human Rights Watch and you're living in one of the most idyllic places on the planet.
You know, actually yesterday, 11 years ago, one of my best friends, Tim Hetherington, was killed in Misrata by a mortar. We had been together just a few weeks before his death. And I spent...
Can you say who Tim Hetherington is? Because he's I mean, for people who've watched, Iraq and Afghanistan as a journalist, he's one of the most, of his generation, best war journalists there was. Yeah,
he was one of the top war photographers. He, together with Sebastian Junger, made the movie Restrepo about American Marines in Afghanistan. But he really cared about telling the stories of victims, and that's why we worked together so much. But that kind of started me on the journey away from working in conflict zones. Because, it's a very dangerous job. It's a very traumatic job as well. I was with Jim Foley just a few weeks before he was abducted in Syria and ultimately beheaded by Daesh, the Islamic State, as the first American journalist they killed. You lose a lot of friends in this business. You almost got killed yourself in Macedonia when the Macedonians blew up your armored car, the BBC car.
It was meant to be bulletproof, that armored car. Well, I got out of it when they blew it up.
It wasn't artillery proof. I still want to see that expense claim to the BBC, but anyway. Yeah. But it wasn't just losing friends. It was really the collective trauma of listening to people talking about these horrors. And then you have to reread your notes time and time again to get the facts straight. So you're reliving these horrific stories of rape. So in 2017, I said enough. I just don't want to subject myself. I've done enough. I want to do something different. And I went to university to study marine biology. So I decided to go back to the sea. And I work in ocean conservation for a UK charity, Blue Ventures, where we basically work with local fishing communities to put in place conservation plans for their marine resources, to make sure there's enough fish and octopus and everything around for their children.
And that's why you're in a hotel room in the south of Madagascar now.
Yes, and I'll be spending the next week with villagers on these idyllic, touristy coast villages, talking about how to save their fisheries. It's a good job.
But you are on the move as well, aren't you? You're going somewhere else quite soon.
Yes, so we're going to set up the same kind of projects in West Africa. So I'll be moving to Dakar over the summer to direct our operations in West Africa for Blue Ventures.
Fantastic. Well,
Yes.
Peter, I wish you the best of luck. I'm going to bully my audience because I could go on asking questions for the rest of the day, but that's not the point. It's been really good talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And
see you on the next political tour to Madagascar or Senegal then.
Well, we've got to set one up, haven't we? Great. Thank you very much indeed, Peter.